Okay, it looks like the um, people have slowed down. It looks like we have a really great mix. Can you all see the results, or do I need to share that? I'm not a great poll person. You can't see. Okay. And the poll, share results. Um, a really, really good mix of folks that are directly involved with student attendance and folks that are indirectly. So I think there's some good interventions and information that Nick and Johann will be able to share with you all today, and a good mix of direct sort of school staff and community-based staff. So thanks for giving us that gauge. Okay, I am excited to get us going and hand it over to, hopefully, Nick.
Awesome. Thanks, Mary. Well, I'm super excited to get to join the Colorado Reengagement Network call today and really kind of have a conversation with you all about chronic absenteeism. I think my role here will really be to kind of frame up some foundational level and some national level data to share about chronic absenteeism, what it is, how it's impacting folks across the country, a little bit of context of some intervention, and then I get to pass it off to Johann, who's going to give a more Colorado focus to the conversation, share some data and pieces like that. So definitely want to start out with just really having a conversation about what is chronic absenteeism. So chronic absenteeism, as it's defined in most states, and certainly it is in Colorado, is missing 10% or more of the school year. And to be chronically absent over the course of a school year, let's say it's 180 days for a school year, that really means missing only 18 school days in a year. So that's 2 days in a month, and you are chronically absent. So it can add up very quickly, it can sneak in, and it's often kind of an issue that if you're not paying attention to it, it's hidden in plain sight. So a lot of schools may look at or focus on average daily attendance, for example, and that can really mask what's happening at the individual student level. So to be clear, we're talking about excused absences, we're talking about unexcused absences, and we're talking about out of school suspension. So the whole point here is that lost instructional time is lost instructional time, regardless of whatever reason we're assigning to it. We really want to pay attention to the fact that young people are just not in school and missing out on a lot of opportunity in their learning for academics and also social emotional growth. So as we go into the next slide, we can talk a little bit about kind of how this is maybe different, how chronic absenteeism is different than some models that maybe we've all seen before, been familiar with. And I will say, I think Colorado does a great job with chronic absenteeism. Johann, I know, has been doing a lot of work of getting the data out there and really starting to get more and more trainings out there to all the schools. So it feels like Colorado is definitely a state who's on top of it with chronic absenteeism. But like I said, so if we're looking at only things like average daily attendance, that can sometimes show us when there's maybe dips in the overall attendance, but it really does mask individual student attendance. We could say, great, we have 93, 94% attendance, but your chronic absenteeism rate could still be 30%. So really important that we're not just looking at that. The other thing I would look at is truancy. You all, Mary, can I like bring you in real quick? Is CYC doing work?
Yeah, with DPS, we are doing some upstream truancy supports with middle and high school students.
Awesome. And then so I know in Colorado we've got a bit of a truancy model, but from what I remember in places like Denver, it still is a pretty progressive way of looking at absenteeism, where the whole point here is to rally support around families. So in Colorado, there's a lot of work happening that's really positive, like the work that CYC is doing in supporting young people going through a truancy process. But truancy is really about only looking at unexcused absences. It's about criminalizing a lot of times what's happening when young people are missing school. And it's really about compliance. So very different than chronic absenteeism, where we're talking about all absences. We're talking about trying to be proactive, catch those absences early. And it really does cultivate a spirit of we're in this together and we're partners with family. We're not adversarial and only looking for compliance. So if we can move into the next slide. Mary, can I bring you in again? Just because I know you. I think you are the expert in this space. When we look at chronic absenteeism, we're talking about a lot of different levels, but throughout school, one of the things that we know with young people who are chronically absent is by the time they get to third grade, they're not reading at grade level oftentimes because they've lost so much school. And again, this does not matter if we're talking about excused absences or unexcused absences. And Mary, I didn't give you a heads up on this, but I'm wondering, when we talk about like reading at grade level in third grade, tell me about how that may play out down the line.
Yeah. Are you asking for the story of up until third grade, you're learning to read, and
Yeah,
after
like
that,
why
you're
it
reading to
matters.
learn? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
without that, everything sort of builds upon itself, and students can get so far behind.
Yeah, right. It can be, there's a direct line to young people leaving school in high school. And so I didn't want to pretend to know the language around third grade reading in the way that you
Yeah.
do. Um, so just to be clear, all the research around chronic absenteeism, why we're looking at it, why it's a really big deal, is there is so much evidence that shows chronic absenteeism, pre-K, kindergarten, first, second. There's a really big indicator that young people who are chronically absent are less likely to read at grade level by third grade. And Mary, what you're saying is like how that will impact students down the line and how that's a really early predictor of young people leaving school. It's a big deal. We also know that young people who are chronically absent in their middle school age are less likely to hit some higher academic achievement. And we know by the time they're in high school, they are more likely to drop out of school. So this is really, chronic absenteeism is a really early predictor of school outcomes. It's a really big predictor of things like equity as well. So when we want to talk about what's changed, and obviously we know the pandemic has had a major impact. Some of you may have been reading about chronic absenteeism in the newspaper. It was in the New York Times last week. There's a big article on chronic absenteeism. So as we go into this next slide, we've got a little bit of the national data to give a bit of context. So chronic absenteeism, when we're talking about pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, the rates have nearly doubled. So the amount of young people that are chronically absent has nearly doubled across the country. So we're talking about going from 16% pre-pandemic, and we're now up to 29.7, 30%. That was in 21, 22. So the pandemic, we know, has exacerbated a lot of the inequities that exist. And it's really showing out in things like chronic absenteeism, where we've seen our rates double, and the number of young people who are chronically absent is really off the charts. It's unlike anything we've ever seen before. So this gives a little bit of the national context of what's been going on. We can go into the next slide. So here it's important to look at 30% overall, but there's a lot of inequities in some of the data. So we can see, and I think Johann's going to share a little bit, we can see that if certain identities or life experiences are there, you are more likely to be chronically absent. Cool. I think we can go to the next one. Oh, did that go to the next one? I think my screen is frozen.
Oop, hold on, now I'm going the wrong way.
Might
Can
be
you
me,
see
Mary.
9? Yeah, can you see it?
I think mine is stuck.
Julia or anyone else, do you see when a
We can
student
see the
misses
ripples
school?
slide.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, you can see ripples.
yep.
Great. I can't, but I think my computer's just being weird. But I can speak to that. So when we talk about chronic absenteeism, it impacts so many factors in a school building. It'll impact other students, it'll impact teachers, it can slow down instructional rates. So it really has a major impact on all students, not just those that are chronically absent. Next slide, and maybe tell me what's there. Is this the positive conditions for learning?
Yes.
Yep.
Beautiful. And Johann, are you speaking to this later?
I'll briefly reference it, but yeah, go ahead. And yeah. So.
Cool. Positive conditions for learning are really that foundational level of how what schools need. So we're talking about physical safety, we're talking about emotional safety. We want to talk about academic challenge. That's one that's often neglected. So really making sure that what young people are getting in the classroom is something that can really challenge them. So if we don't have something as simple as just challenging academics, young people might disengage. And the last one, I believe, is the adult and student well-being. So when we're talking about adult and student well-being, that's another foundational level of kind of what is it that needs to be in place. So if we look at these 4 quadrants, and if we have a chronic absenteeism issue in our school or young people are missing school, oftentimes you can go back to one of these 4 areas and say like, oh, I think this area is really impacting maybe this specific student or our school overall. And I really appreciate with this graphic that academic challenge is in there. I think a lot of times it's like, oh, this kid doesn't have a sense of belonging. This kid is really struggling with something in the mental health world. But let's also look at ourselves as schools as well and say like, are we actually meaningfully challenging our students academically? Is this a piece for them that when they come to class, are we giving them culturally relevant material? So chronic absenteeism is not always explained away so easily. I think a lot of times we are very quick to blame students, to blame families. And if we don't have these positive conditions for learning across our school, that can be a really huge problem when we're talking about addressing this systemically. Next slide. I pulled up my other slides, which seem to be working. So, we have kind of 4 buckets that we talk about at Attendance Works as to why young people may be missing school. So we've got barriers, aversions, disengagement, and misconceptions. And oftentimes it's really, really important to think about why are young people leaving school or missing school. If we don't understand the why behind why students aren't coming in, it's really hard to address this situation. So if you are in a school that has 30+% chronic absenteeism, it's really important that you're investigating the why behind these absences. What is it? There's a lot of health barriers for some young people. Other young people, it's the fact that there's not culturally relevant material. For a lot of families, it's not that big of a deal to miss 1, 2, 3 days a month. With the pandemic, we all kind of had a mindset shift of being in school every day is really different. Like the tone and the mentality around being in school every day has changed, and schools quite literally barred students and families from coming in. And now all of a sudden we're saying, no, be here every day. And it's like, well, we can miss a day, we can miss another day, we can miss another day. Before you know it, you've missed 18 days over the course of a school year. You're chronically absent, and we know that that's going to have an impact on your academics. We know it has an impact on social emotional well-being, and it has an impact on other students that maybe aren't chronically absent, but aren't getting as much material because the teacher has had to slow down the class for a lot of reteaching. There's been a lot more classroom management because students are relearning the habits of being in school. So it has a huge impact. So really important to kind of dive into the reasons behind why young people are missing school. Next slide. So we've got our MTSS triangle. This is going to look really familiar, hopefully, to a lot of people. But MTSS and attendance is something I always like to highlight and point out. We have tier 1, 2, and 3 levels of where we're talking about introducing intervention. A lot of times schools have MTSS. It's very focused on academics. We want to weave in and make sure schools are weaving in MTSS to attendance response. So what are those foundational levels? And in our pyramid at Attendance Works, we've got a foundational level, and that foundational level is those positive conditions for learning, which we were just talking about. So then we get into tier 1. Tier 1 is universal. This is for everyone. So this is for every single student that walks in those doors. How are we ensuring that we're building a strong sense of belonging and that young people want to be in our schools? As we go up to tier 2, these are students that may be missing about 10% or 19% of school. So it's really important, I would highlight, to notice this in October, November. You can still be missing 10% of school and not have hit those 18 days, right? Because you've missed 10% of the total membership days. So at that point, you can address it, you can talk about it, you can introduce tier 2 interventions. And then tier 3 is really those students that are missing 20% or more of school. This tends to get most of the attention, I would say, a lot of times in schools of like, whoa, this kid has missed a lot. we need to put all our energy into finding them and getting them back to level. So a lot of schools will start to invest way more in tier 3 than they do in tier 1. So as we go into, I think the next slide is hopefully a poll. Sweet. Is that, Mary, is the poll, is that something we can launch? I don't know why my Zoom is still being great. So the poll question that is there in the slide, I'm curious to know from the folks here, where would you say your school is at, or if you're not part of a school, maybe your kid's school, or maybe where you're doing some work or a partner you have, where would you say your school is putting the most efforts? Would you say it's in the tier 1 where you're just really working on belonging, greeting every student at the door by their name, things like that? Would you say it's more tier 3 where students are, we're just putting a lot of focus and energy into those students that have missed so much school? Just curious of where folks are at.
All right, we got a few more results coming in, so we'll give it one more second. Can you see it, Nick?
I cannot, which is super cool.
Okay, so it looks like we have 8% in foundational supports, 25% in tier 1, absenteeism prevention, 25% in tier 2, early intervention, and then definitely that, like you were saying, right, the 42% in that absenteeism tier 3 intensive supports.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that makes, that's something that's pretty common, is that we see tier 3 intervention really taking a lot of the energy of school. It's a lot of times what you have to do, you have like legal requirements that come in at that point with things like truancy. I would say to folks, as you are doing this work and looking at tiered interventions, how you can get closer to putting more energy into foundational supports, more energy into tier 1 supports, is going to have a major impact. I know firsthand from the work that I'm doing here in Vermont, once you get into tier 3 work and you're working with students, that's pretty intensive intervention that we're looking to do at that point. Those students have missed 20+% of the school year. So part of it is finding them. Part of it is really understanding, hopefully, what's happening with the family. Are you centering the family's voice? Are you having conversations with them? Are you doing a home visit? It takes a lot. Like, schools typically don't have capacity to do anything other than just react and respond. But the more proactive we can be, and the more we can build in these systems of support to really look at how are we boosting tier 1 intervention for attendance? How are we boosting our foundational supports so that, in September, October, November, you're able to invest much more in that space than you are just waiting for a student to hit tier 3 and then being super reactive for the rest of the year because you don't have the capacity or energy to do anything else. So thanks for taking that poll. I think that's the end of my slides. So I'm going to pass it to Johann, and Mary, I might refresh my Zoom.
Yep, we'll go. Sounds good.
Nick, I think the one slide that was in there was just the interactive map where folks could find the national data.
Oh,
so there's a slide on that one if folks wanted to look at that. Kind of a cool way to see 2021-22 data. So.
Yeah, thanks, Johann. I threw that in there as a quick reference that if anybody wants to look at district by district chronic absenteeism rates, it's 21-22 at this point, which is already well out of date. And I know Johann's going to bring some more recent info.
Thanks.
Cool. All right. Great. Thanks, everybody. Good to talk to you. Thanks for joining the call this afternoon. I'm Johann. I'm in the Dropout Prevention Office at CDE. And I'm going to start with yeah, just a little bit of an overview on some of the student engagement metrics, similar stuff to what Nick was sharing, but for kind of Colorado specific data. I'll start with just a few things to reinforce what Nick said. One, we are the dropout prevention office, so folks oftentimes think of like it's just we're just focused on dropouts, right? Or we're just focused on re-engaging those kids who have disconnected. And I think we've really tried to shift that you know, dropping out or disengagement from school is not a one-time event. There are very few kids who seem to be doing fine and all of a sudden leave school the next day. So we are really trying to think of engagement as a continuum. So obviously we want to reduce the number of kids who drop out. We want to re-engage kids who have already dropped out. But chronic absenteeism is actually one of our best early indicators of kids who are starting to disengage. And so we think about those as connected. And then lastly, we want to connect that to really deep engagement and learning, right? That's really what we want. We want kids in classrooms with deep engagement and learning. And so these are all connected together. So we like to think about them kind of across that. If you go to the next one, this is the same as Nick's slide on the what this means at different grade levels. There's good research across K-12 about how important this is in pre-K, kindergarten, those patterns of attendance, how important it is in middle school, those patterns of success in school, more likely to stay connected, more likely to pass courses. Really good research at the high school level of how important it is, both for kids who have low attendance, much more likely to fail courses and drop out, kids with high attendance, much more likely to stay connected and graduate. So just reinforcing those things that Nick shared, and we know it's important, and we know it's important across kind of K-12. And then lastly, just an acknowledgement that is getting a lot of recognition. I'm sure folks have seen different news articles, but recently the US Department of Ed has also highlighted that they think that they highlighted 3 different practices that really felt like could help us come back strongly from the pandemic, and chronic absenteeism was one of those things. So they called that out. So I think there's a good growing recognition that like if we're going to really dig into this, we need to address the chronic absenteeism, and so the work that many of you are doing on this is incredibly important to reconnect kids to learning opportunities and in the work that they're doing. Okay, so I'm going to start. You can actually go to the next one and just share this one. It is newer data, but it still is feeling as we're getting close to the end of the 23-24 school year. We'll have even more updated data. Just the way that we get data from the state level is we get an end of year data collection from our school districts in the state. So we don't necessarily know. We hear anecdotally or data districts might share in a presentation with us, but our kind of formal collection on this is at the end of the year. But I'm going to share kind of 3 main takeaways that we had from the 22-23 data. And kind of talk through those. And I think they give us some kind of indication of where things are going and how we might organize some of our responses. So those are the 3. There's one is positive. We've seen some good progress in a number of key metrics. The second one is that we still see pretty high rates of chronic absenteeism and disengagement. And then 3, we're not seeing students experience engagement consistently. There's differences across different regions, student groups, et cetera. So we'll start with the good news. So this is our state chronic absenteeism rate. So as Nick mentioned, this is the percentage of students who missed 10% or more of school. And as you can see, we were above the national average before the pandemic. So we were in the kind of low 20%, and the nation, I think you shared, was like 16-17%. So we were a little bit higher. We had a huge spike in 21-22, and then we made some improvements. So we went down about 5 percentage points to 31%. So good progress. That's about 50,000 fewer kids who are chronically absent. So good progress. A lot more students consistently engaged. And then on the right-hand side, the pie chart, if you look at kind of the blue and the gray together, you have about 75% of the districts across the state either stayed the same or got better in their chronic absenteeism rate. So we saw a pretty broad improvement as well. It wasn't driven by just a couple of big districts. We saw a pretty broad improvement there. So that's the positive news. We're seeing some progress on that. We are seeing pretty broad across the state movement. And it's actually fairly similar to what we see in state dropout rates. So the chart on the right-hand side is the same chart that was on the previous one. That's our state chronic absenteeism rate. So you can see that we went up to 36% and then down slightly. Our statewide dropout rate, you can see over the past, that one's about 10 years, I think it's 9 years, but almost 10 years of rates. You can see that we've made steady progress in fewer students dropping out each year. We had a similar spike in 21-22, and one of the biggest increases that we've seen since we started tracking data in this way. And again, we went in the right direction in 22-23. Although for both of these, you'll notice as we get to number 2 that they're both quite high, right? They are the second highest rate for chronic absenteeism. We are back 4 or 5 years in our dropout rate. So they are positive news, but we still are at pretty high levels of inconsistent engagement and of disengagement. And then we do look at some of these other rates too. We focus on chronic absenteeism because we think that gives us a best picture of it. But you see a somewhat similar trend if you look at just an average daily attendance rate. So you can see we were in the 92 percentage point, around 92% pre-pandemic. We took a big drop to around 90%, and we have started to move back up again. And similarly for districts, we saw about 75% of districts have better average daily attendance rates in 22-23. So kind of a very similar trend. It's kind of the flip side of that, but we're seeing that in some of our other attendance metrics as well. Okay, so that's the first one, positive news. But as I shared, as you can see in many of those charts that I just shared, we have incredibly high numbers, and many districts have high numbers as well. So just big, large scale of it, that's almost 270,000 kids across the state who were chronically absent. Almost 1 out of every 3 Colorado kids, K through 12, who missed more than 10% of school. So it is impacting a really broad swath of districts, and it's that part of it has been really interesting. So almost everyone saw increases in that time period that through the pandemic. Our districts that were at 10% before it saw increases, and our districts that were at 35% before it saw increases. So it had a pretty broad impact across that. And so we have incredibly high numbers just overall when you look at that. And then we do have a smaller number of districts that have kind of the most Nick's organization, Attendance Works, has been talking about this as like extreme chronic absenteeism. So there are 30 districts with more than 40% of students. So I love that ripple graphic that Nick shared. If you think about what that means in a classroom when 40% of the kids are missing that much time, what it means for like across a week about how a teacher tries to keep each one of those kids up to speed or generally on the same lesson, how complicated that gets, and interesting research just on like what the implications are for those other things, that attendance is no longer a norm, that it becomes more okay for you to leave. And so you can just kind of see all of these ripples out. So especially at our kind of most intensive, we do have a smaller group of districts, but that are heavily impacted, and we are seeing it impact a lot of different elements of that, not just for those kids, but impacting a lot of other pieces of that. And that's more than we've had. We've never had that many districts with that high, kind of that extreme kind of chronic absent rate. Okay. And then the third one is we're seeing this chronic absenteeism rates vary for different student groups. And I think this hopefully gives us some indication of like where we can think about support. While we have broad areas that we want to impact, there are definitely some areas where it's showing up. So the first one is grade level. And you can kind of see it's a little bit of a U shape. And so this chart looks kindergarten as the bars all the way on the left, all the way up to 12th grade, and then the statewide rates. The light blue one is 21-22, and the dark blue is 22-23. And so the positive news is that every grade level got better. So we saw improvements at every grade level. But you can see that we're still, we are pretty high in our early grades. So you kind of have high in kindergarten first, we dropped down, I think 4th and 5th were almost exactly the same this year, and then they kind of went up towards 11th and 12th grade. The interesting thing this last year, I think, is that our kindergarten rates stayed fairly high. So as you can see on the slide, kindergarten, 11th and 12th were our highest rates of chronic absenteeism. So one, I think those patterns, obviously we know how important those are in kindergarten, but also in the types of interventions or supports that we think about are going to be very different for a kindergarten student, right, who is than an 11th or 12th grader, right, and how we think about support being different in those two different spaces. So that's the first one. It's just like grade level, we're definitely seeing quite a variation in those, even as we see some improvement across the grades. And then similarly to the national chart that you saw, we are seeing different rates when we look at different racial and ethnic groups. So the dotted black line in the middle is our statewide rate. And this one looks, it's kind of 3 different school years. So you can see the trend over those school years. And you can see that we have pretty wide gaps between different student groups. So if you look at like the green one, which is just below, is white students. Black students is the yellow line, kind of just above. So, but even that one, which is kind of our closest one there, we still are seeing, you know, gaps of 15 to 20% between those, and they get even wider as you go to some of the other student groups. So we're still seeing gaps between racial and ethnic groups. A few places where they're closing a little bit, but still pretty substantial gaps. And then the last one, this is, I should have spelled that out, but it's programs and service types, basically. So groups of students, so multilingual learners, migrant students, students with, who have an individual education plan. And again, you can see on this one, we see pretty substantial gaps on that. The black line, dotted line is our statewide average. The data for homeless students and students in foster care is some of our biggest gaps and kind of the most extreme levels of that. That's almost 30 percentage points difference there. And you can imagine, right, the complications of coming to school regularly if you don't have a stable place to live, right? You can imagine what that entails for them. So anyway, so that's the kind of last one I think from me, is just like that we see those, but we don't see it happening consistently. We're seeing pretty big gaps as we look at different groups. Okay. And then I think, Mary, I don't know if you had a particular one or if we just wanted to pause here for any questions on any of the data stuff before we moved into kind of intervention ideas for response side.
Yeah, I think exactly that. Let's just take a quick second. If anyone has any questions that they want to throw in the chat for Johann or Nick or both, we can answer some questions, and we will then be moving into some intervention opportunities, and then we can do more questions at the end too. But any questions right now?
I have one.
Great.
Seeing all the data about, starting, in elementary school, going through high school, and how, there's a lot of value in addressing chronic absenteeism earlier and starting to have those conversations with students and families. What it feels like elementary schools maybe have fewer resources around working with families, outreach. I'm curious about like strategies that are happening in elementary schools versus I'm more familiar with what's happening, in the high school space. And we might be touching on that later, but that's just kind of what's coming up for me.
I could speak to some of the things that I've seen just with other districts across the country, but also here in Vermont. We have, I would say elementary schools actually have some pretty decent social emotional learning staff, and response to that. It is all about, at that age, obviously, right? It is so much all about family support. You start to look at things like pre-K too, how you can form habits in pre-K. A lot of things like home visits, family welcome nights, those are huge. So when you're talking about chronic absenteeism at any level, you're talking about building relationships first. Like if you don't have that, when we go back to those 4 positive conditions for learning, at the center, at the core of that is positive relationships. So when we're doing that work here in our district, we're talking about, doing summer home visits, which I know is being done in Colorado, having conversations with our students and families. Going back to that barrier slide that I shared, really getting a better understanding and listening to our families first and foremost. Tell me, what we can be doing better as a school is a really good way to ask that question. Because it's us, right? Like, we have to address that as schools and as school staff. We can't say, why are you not coming? It's how can we support you to be able to be here? So there's so many ways, but it's all about family relationships and engagement in that way. I don't know, Johann, if you want to build on that.
Yeah, I think I'd probably share something similar. I think like the role of family is just so much bigger in that space, right? When you think about what it takes for a 5 or 6-year-old to get to school and get to school on time and ready to dig in. Yeah, so I think I would, just second that one. I think that plays a much more prominent role in how we do it. And then, I don't know, I think elementary schools are actually really well set up to do a bunch of the prevention activities, and really, in some ways, naming them and targeting them around attendance. But like a lot of our, I don't know, I think some of the practices that we think of so essential for elementary schools, like about relationship building, about engagement and learning, about, all of these different pieces of what they are doing. I don't know, I think they're well placed to do some of those. So yeah.
Thanks, Julia. Any other questions before we move into more of the intervention space? Okay.
All righty.
Oops, sorry.
Okay. So
I'm
we'll
jumping.
actually, can you go to the one before that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
All right.
going.
So this question we get all the time. So you share the data, like, okay, great. And why is this happening? And what do we do about it? So we're going to give you the magic solution here for solving this. So there's not a perfect solution for this, but I think we'll share just a couple of things that we've learned, I think, in why districts and school staff, I think, feel like some of this might be happening, and then also just how we organize and respond to it. So we have kind of 4 big ones. You can go to the next slide there, Mary, of what we've heard, I think, most consistently. There's not a formal data collection on this of like what is driving these, but these are kind of ones that we have heard that I think have resonated with a pretty broad group of schools and districts. So I'll quickly kind of go through each of those. So one, I think, are kind of health and wellness reasons that are driving some of this. So some of this is, especially at the elementary school, I think, is how do we think about sickness, right? And how do we think about how sick is too sick to come to school? I have 2 little kiddos who have snotty noses all the time, right? And so I think for 3 years, we were very cautious on that front, right? And so anytime that happened, we were saying, let's stay home. Let's try to avoid those, right? We're not wanting to spread this. But how do we renorm on that? What should that look like now? And so we're still valuing and trying to balance those different. So I think we definitely see it there. And then also we see it, I think, maybe more at the high school level or middle and high school level, but we are seeing increased, students are responding. We have a couple of statewide surveys where students are saying that they feel anxiety or feel unsafe at school, feel anxious about being there. And so those rates are higher than we have seen before. And so how do we think about health, a holistic view of health, that we want kids to feel safe, welcome at school, and be comfortable being there, and be able to work through some of those parts of it. So I think we're seeing that as some of it that is driving some of it. One that I think is connected that we don't often talk about, but just in some of our statewide metrics, we're seeing schools and districts struggle with staffing. So we have like a statewide survey that shows higher rates of turnover among staff over the last couple of years. We hire long-term substitutes or vacancies in positions. And we know that can impact how schools operate. who a kid sees consistently on a day-to-day basis. If that relationship is changing or there's a different, it just changes that dynamic. So that's one that we don't often think of as impacting attendance, but we know it impacts the operations of districts and how we make sure that the right folks are there and able to work with kids. The gray box, I think we're definitely just seeing that there's such a high level of need that more districts are needing to build additional supports. So this is the district we ran called like an attendance learning cohort this year, pulled districts from around the state to think about how they're tackling attendance. And some of the districts that were struggling the most were not our districts who had 45%, but they were districts who went from 10% chronic absenteeism to 22%. So it doubled it. And they were overwhelmed because they had never had to have an attendance team or a structure around it. They could have one person tackle it. And so that, I think we're seeing that like for that district, as well as the 40% district, like it feels overwhelming. They're feeling the process of resetting on this is hard and feeling overwhelmed and not having resources. And then the last one is kind of this value of in-person learning and or live lessons even if you're in an online school, but that live lesson, that live student connection, student to teacher connection, student to student. As students were able to do work remotely, what's pulling them back in to say, yep, we want you to be here for this amount of time. And so I think we're seeing that probably more broadly as a society, but it's showing up in schools and especially in our high schools, right, where kids are challenging some of that of like, well, I could do this homework remotely last year. What am I getting by being here in person, or what's pulling me into that? So I think that's a challenge that we're working through, showing up in our schools and how we're tackling it. So those are our kind of big four ones that we are seeing and I think hearing from districts about different kind of reasons of why we might be seeing that. And I think also helpful insight into just how we think about organizing responses. So I'll share just two big ideas for this. Again, we're going to reinforce on this one, but I think we have kind of two things that we recommend that schools and districts think about when doing this, and what we've seen when schools and districts are able to be effective in that. The first one is this conditions for learning, right? We set the positive conditions for learning. I always share that like our two best preventative measures I kind of pick within this, but like kids who have a strong relationship at school. So they have a strong relationship with an adult at school and they are engaged and challenged in their class. Like what they're learning about is engaging and challenging. Like those are still our best preventative measures. And when those are there, even if other things happen, it is so much easier to be able to respond and intervene and support around that. But so we really have to like, how do we double down and make sure that we have those strong foundations and structures to support attendance? And then similarly, how do we be responsive? How do we build up our tiered support system to be able to respond and think about that? So I'll share a few just resources if you're interested in thinking about those different ways. Attendance Works, and it can talk to a couple of the tools around some of those kind of that planning of things. And I have a couple that I've pulled just around the intervention side of it. You can go to the next and I'll share just a couple of those. So one, we're just encouraging folks to do some resource mapping of what you have available and what you're thinking about. This is just a few samples that we pulled from a group of grantees that we worked with, but doing these tier one, these foundational proactive things to be really intentional about relationships, really intentional about what learning looks like. And then we're thinking about how do we build connections when students are facing or families are facing challenges? How do we think about those as you go into targeted or more intensive supports? And then I think the last one that I have, Mary, if you go to the next, yeah, you can go one more. We'll drop these into the chat, but these are two, I think, really helpful resources. I really like the first one. It's called Reducing Chronic Absenteeism, but it provides really nice summaries about what works around interventions. The second one is good as well. It's more intervention specific. So if you are thinking about like a home visit model, there's like research on home visits. Or if you're thinking about like how to improve your school nursing program, or you like your food service program, like it's kind of more intervention one. I like the first one because I think it pulls some good information of kind of what we've learned from a couple of different spaces. But those are good ones, I think, just as good reference points. Again, as you're thinking about doing some resource mapping of like what's available, and then how do we learn and continue to get better on these and target our interventions and supports a little bit more. So, and then you go to the next. And so this is like an identification from that. This is one that we have used in training a fair amount, but instead of just like here's the intervention that we've used, I think like some summary ideas around it. So there's this idea of like every absence needs a response, right? And so there's some really interesting research around like how do you encourage two-way communication in that? How do you make sure there's accurate information so parents have a really clear picture of what their attendance actually is? So some of those things that you could kind of learn from that. There's actually really interesting stuff in there on recognition type strategies and some kind of actually some words of caution on how we use those. They're very common uses of those, but there's actually for some groups of students, they haven't been as successful. So how do we just think about if we're going to use those, how do we target them a little bit more? Tons of evidence of how intentional relationship building is really preventative and positive and helps us be responsive when we need to. And then there are cases for intensive partnerships as well, where like students or families need intensive support to be able to get over barriers to address that. So it's kind of set up in that format, and I think it provides a nice way to think about not just like, should I do this program or this particular approach, but what could I learn from this that would help me intervene and respond. So, all right. I think I'm going to pass it back to Nick on this, or maybe to Mary for that one. And then I think I just have one more slide for resources and any questions to upset.
Yeah, we wanted to, put in a quick question here for you all. What have you seen working? You can use the chat, you can chime in. What are you using in your schools or with your students? Or what are you seeing if you're a parent with your child's school? Would love to hear if any of those interventions or items that Johann just brought up resonate, or if there's anything else. Yeah, we will send out a recap email, Maria, I see it in the chat, with the slides and everything in there as well. Well, we will move on if no one has anything to share. Everyone's learning so many new things that it's all sinking in.
All right, cool. I'll drop a couple of these things in. If folks are interested in learning more or want to talk about different pieces of it, I'll put out my contact info, and Amy, who's on our team, who leads a couple of our grant programs that overlap with attendance as well. So reach out to either one of us. We have a couple of different things, but I'll drop in kind of our contact info. And then if you're interested in the data stuff, there is some more. If you want to dig into some of the spreadsheets and charts and things like that, I can share those as well. And then I just put in there a couple of those intervention ones. So yeah, thank you all for having me, and appreciate your interest in digging into this and focusing on this work.
I think we have one more too from Nick.
Yeah. So I just wanted to put this in there as a link to folks. So the Attendance Works website has a lot of resources, everything from just simple handouts for families that are age appropriate, and you could look K-3 and middle school and high school. There's also some other really good tips and tools on the website, things like how you send a letter home and how you write that letter. If folks look at the letters they're sending home for attendance, for example, I would encourage you to read what you have there and see how many times something like court is referenced or other things. If you're leading with court and truancy and other things, or if you're leading with, how can we help, is really different. So there's just a lot of great resources, and I wanted to put that link out there for folks that may want to follow up on that.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. All right. Well, thank you all for attending today. Thanks so much to Johann and Nick. I feel like I learned a lot as well, and it's super helpful actually to have the two sort of resources all together in one place and reference point, and just thinking through, the reasons why slide, Johann, that anxiety and mental health piece, we really are hearing a lot. And so I haven't really heard it though, which oddly enough, tied to chronic absenteeism. And obviously that is such a huge, huge reason. So again, thank you all for being here. If you do have any follow-up questions, hit us up and we will be sending out these resources and the PowerPoint. And I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.